Opening the center allows for rapid piece development and immediate influence over the board's heart. Mirroring the opponent's central pawn thrust immediately contests crucial central squares and signals a fight for positional equality. Opening a path for the queen and bishop while developing a knight to a natural attacking square, preparing for central control. Developing a piece to control the center and defend the e-pawn is a fundamental and logical response to white's aggressive opening. Inviting a fight for central space, this bishop targets the knight, creating immediate tension and influencing the board's geometric balance. Challenging the bishop immediately, this pawn push forces a decision, potentially opening lines or creating pawn weaknesses. Maintaining the bishop's diagonal pressure forces black to commit their pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for pawn breaks while developing a piece, this calmly builds black's structural integrity. Securing the king is the immediate priority, preparing to develop the rook to a more active square. Challenging the knight's influence, this bishop aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially weaken the pawn structure around the king. Challenging the bishop's comfortable position immediately creates a dialogue about piece activity and whether black truly wants to maintain the bishop's current influence. This pawn push forces a decision, potentially opening lines or creating a slight weakness if the bishop retreats awkwardly. Relocating the bishop to h5 challenges white's central pawn structure and opens a diagonal, potentially creating tactical skirmishes. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's development and force a decision regarding the pinned knight. Securing the center and preparing to expand on the queen side, this maneuver aims to solidify white's pawn structure and prevent black from gaining undue influence in the d5 square, potentially setting the stage for a queenside pawn storm or a controlled advance. Unleashing the queen onto the central stage now, black seeks to directly challenge white's knight and simultaneously prepare for potential pawn pushes that could disrupt white's cozy kingside setup. This proactive stance aims to create immediate complications and potentially gain tempo if white mishandled. Unleashing a pawn storm at the cost of weakening your king's defenses and potentially overextending. Prepare for a sharp, tactical battle where precise calculation and piece activity will be paramount. Retreating the bishop to g6 now abandons the bishop's prior active diagonal, weakening the king's shield and allowing white's kingside pawns to continue their aggressive advance, potentially isolating black's king even further. Challenging the center immediately, white aims to break open lines and activate pieces, forcing black to react to this central pawn thrust before castling or consolidating further, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Sacrificing the bishop here opens a critical diagonal for your queen, but it also surrenders a pawn and creates a dynamic tension. Carefully assess if the ensuing initiative justifies the material deficit and the potential weaknesses around your king. Reclaiming central influence while preparing to expand on the kingside, this knight's repositioning offers a dynamic yet solid retreat, avoiding immediate pawn exchanges that could compromise white's structure. Repositioning the bishop to g6 once more, black seeks to solidify its presence on the queenside while preparing to potentially challenge white's central pawn thrust. This maneuver avoids immediate tactical complications, but invites white to further expand their central control, potentially leading to a cramped position for black's pieces if not handled carefully. Shattering the symmetry of black's knight defense, this bishop sacrifice aims to dismantle the opponent's pawn structure and create lasting weaknesses on the queenside, potentially paving the way for easier pawn advances or increased piece activity. Doubling the b-pawns creates a significant structural weakness for black, leaving the queenside exposed and potentially hindering piece mobility. Embracing open lines, white initiates a decisive pawn thrust, immediately disrupting black's central structure and demanding a response that will inevitably clarify the position's tactical landscape. The capture on e5 creates immediate pressure, forcing black to address the central pawn imbalance, potentially leading to a doubled c-pawn for black that could become a long-term structural weakness if not handled with utmost care. Consider the implications for piece activity. This daring capture dramatically reshapes the pawn chain and opens avenues that might otherwise have remained stubbornly closed, potentially creating a swift path towards kingside pressure for white. Embracing the doubled pawns for an active central presence, black immediately reclaims the pawn, aiming to leverage the open d-file and potentially challenge white's slightly exposed kingside. The recapture opens lines and injects a dynamic element into the game, though it comes at the cost of structural harmony. Seizing the open central file after black's tentative pawn push, the knight now aggressively occupies territory that will soon become a battlefield, forcing black to reckon with immediate threats against the king's safety and demanding a decisive response to prevent white from dictating the game's rhythm. Developing the bishop to the center offers a crucial defensive anchor against the knight on e5, and simultaneously prepares to contest the d-file, potentially opening avenues for counterplay against white's pawn chain. Clearing the d-file with the knight exchange sacrifices open lines for black's queen and bishop, potentially leading to a dynamic middle game where pawn structure weaknesses on the kingside could be exploited. The queen now boldly claims the center, challenging the knight's established presence and forcing white to consider a difficult decision regarding the pawn structure. Exploiting the king's exposed position, the rook now swings aggressively to the open first rank, directly challenging the monarch and aiming to dismantle the defensive structure. Protecting the king from the immediate threat and preparing to regroup is a sensible, if passive, reaction. However, it leaves the g-pawn exposed and forfeits the castle. Asserting control over the central squares and preparing for an onslaught on black's king. Challenging the established kingside order, this pawn thrust dramatically injects dynamism, aiming to shatter white's nascent spatial advantage and expose the monarch. This exchange seizes the open d-file for white, directly challenging black's vulnerable kingside and introducing serious threats against the now exposed monarch. Embracing the doubled pawns creates a fortress-like pawn structure for black, aiming to consolidate after the exchange of queens and potentially exploit the open c-file. Unleashing the bishop to its most active diagonal, this maneuver seeks to exploit the structural weaknesses already present on black's queenside and simultaneously pressure the vulnerable pawn chain, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and open lines for further advances. Solidifying the pawn structure and opening a vital diagonal for the queen, d5 launches a strategic counteroffensive, aiming to dismantle white's centralized control and potentially launch an assault on the exposed king. A bold gambit for centralized influence, this declaration on the queen's diagonal directly challenges black's pawn structure and seeks to disrupt their developing harmony by forcing a decision. Opening the h-file now offers a direct line for your rook to assault white's already precarious kingside, but it simultaneously exposes your own monarch to white's centralized queen and knight, creating a dangerous tactical crossroads. The queen's repositioning creates a potent squeeze on black's king, directly threatening the weak f7 square while simultaneously preparing to exploit the open b-file. Sacrificing the pawn for an immediate attack on the king, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's defenses and create chaos on the kingside. This aggressive pawn push, while appearing to be a simple capture, opens critical lines and forces white into a defensive posture. The goal is to exploit the momentarily exposed white king. A bold gambit, offering material to rip open the enemy's structure and generate attacking chances against the monarch. The pawn advances, a daring probe to shatter white's pawn shield and ignite a direct assault on the king's refuge. Consider this audacious pawn sacrifice as a way to tear down the carefully constructed pawn wall protecting the white king, hoping for immediate tactical dividends. Unleashing the bishop to g3 immediately secures the kingside pawn structure, bolstering the king's defense against the encroaching black pieces and mitigating the danger posed by the recently advanced g-pawn. The rook's redeployment to the center immediately begins to contest the open d-file, seeking to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially creating defensive resources for black's exposed king. Sharpening the attack with a forceful check, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and exploit the exposed king. The queen's placement forces an immediate reaction, potentially creating new weaknesses or allowing white to consolidate an advantage in the center. Consider how this king-facing maneuver might unravel black's carefully constructed pawn structure.